November the 14th, 2017. A Tuesday. The rain on Valencia Street had turned the gutters into brown rivers, and the neon sign above Manny's gold and guitar buzzed with a loose connection that made the M flicker every 9 seconds. Inside, the air tasted like lemon polish and dust that had been settling since the Clinton administration. A man in a grey windbreaker sat on the wooden bench near the back wall, between a stack of amplifiers and a glass case full of pocket watches nobody had wound in years. He had not spoken to anyone. He had not been spoken to. His sneakers were wet from the walk, and the rubber soles left a faint print on the industrial carpet, but nobody had noticed, because nobody had looked at him. He looked like he had nowhere to be. 20 minutes later, that man would play a guitar in this room, and every phone in the building would be recording. 40 minutes after that, the owner of this shop would be sitting on the floor behind his own counter, holding a receipt he had already torn in half, trying to put it back together with hands that would not stop shaking. The video would reach 11 million views before the weekend. The owner's mother would see it on a Sunday morning and call him, and he would not pick up. But none of that is the part that mattered. The part that mattered started with the front door and the sound of a bell that had not been oiled in 6 years. Carlos Santana had not touched a guitar in 26 months. The last time was in a hospital room at UCSF Medical Center, playing quietly for his wife, Anna, while she slept through the morphine. She had asked him to play Cathedral of Rain, the song he had written for her in 1971, when they were both 19 and he was still busking outside the Fillmore for change. He played it that night with the door closed and his back to the monitor so he would not watch the numbers. She died at 4:12 in the morning. He had been asleep in the chair. He never heard the alarm. That was August of 2015. He sold nothing. He cancelled nothing. He simply stopped. His manager called it a sabbatical. His label called it a concern. His hands called it the truth. For 2 years and 2 months, the fingers that had played in front of 200,000 people at Glastonbury, that had recorded 14 studio albums and been written about in every guitar magazine more times than he could remember, had done nothing more complicated than button a coat. He had come to the Mission today because this is where he used to live. Apartment 4B on Shotwell Street, above a laundromat that had changed owners 3 times and was now a juice bar. He had walked past it this morning and stood there for 4 minutes, looking at the window where Anna used to hang herbs to dry. Rosemary. She grew rosemary in coffee cans on a sill that got 45 minutes of direct sun. The smell of it had lived in the curtains for years. In the left pocket of his windbreaker, wrapped in a square of chamois cloth, he carried a guitar pick his mother had carved for him out of Brazilian rosewood when he was 9 years old. She had shaped it with a kitchen knife and sanded it smooth with 400 grit paper on the floor of their apartment in San Juan. It was the only thing he had played with for the first 5 years of his career. He had not taken it out of the cloth in months. He carried it because he could not leave it at home. It smelled, faintly, like the oil from her hands, and some mornings that smell was the only proof he had that any of it had been real. Manny's Gold and Guitar was the kind of store that looked like a museum exhibit about the death of retail. The fluorescent tubes overhead were the long kind, the kind that take 4 seconds to fully brighten and never quite stop humming. The carpet was industrial gray, worn to the backing in a path between the front door and the counter. There were guitars on the left wall, 40 of them, arranged not by brand or year, but by what would fit, necks pointing in every direction like a school of fish frozen mid-turn. On the right wall, behind smudged glass, were the other things people brought when they needed money by Thursday. Wedding rings sized for fingers that no longer wore them, a trombone with a dent in the bell, a set of golf clubs still carrying red Georgia clay in the grooves. Everything had a price tag written in the same blue marker, the same handwriting, the same blunt confidence. A Les Paul with a cracked headstock, $375. A sapphire ring, $80. The prices were not negotiations. They were sentences. The counter was a glass display case with a wooden top that had been refinished badly, the polyurethane thick and cloudy in the corners. Behind it, a computer monitor showed security camera feeds in 4 quadrants, and a half-eaten turkey sandwich sat on a paper towel beside a can of Dr. Pepper that had gone flat an hour ago. The smell of hot electronics and wood varnish hung at chest level, mixing with the faint sweetness of the soda and something else underneath. Something like wet cardboard, coming from the back room where the overflow inventory lived in stacks that touched the ceiling tiles. 2 women sat near the window, one filling out a form, the other staring at her phone, with her thumb resting on the screen but not moving. A man in a Carhartt jacket examined a power drill like he was reading scripture. Nobody in the room looked like they were having a good week. The customers at Manny's fell into 2 categories. The ones who came in fast, talked fast, took whatever was offered, and left. And the ones who came in slow, talked too much, held the object too long, and left with less money than they needed, and more guilt than they expected. Nobody came to a pawn shop on a winning day. That was the unwritten rule of the room. Every person who walked through that door had already lost something. The only question was how much more they were willing to give up. Kyle Beckman had owned Manny's Gold and Guitar for 3 years, and he ran it the way a man runs a business he never wanted. The shop had been his father's. Manny Beckman, the original Manny, had opened it in 1989 with a lease he could barely afford and a belief that every guitar had a story worth hearing. Manny would sit behind that counter for hours, listening to people talk about where they bought their instruments, who taught them to play, what song they played at their daughter's wedding. He treated every transaction like a conversation. He died in 2014, and Kyle inherited the store along with $212,000 in debt that Manny had never mentioned. Kyle had been a session guitarist in Los Angeles for 6 years before that. Not a bad one. Good enough to get callbacks, good enough to play on 2 records that nobody outside a very specific corner of the internet had ever heard, but never good enough to be the first name on anyone's list. He came back to San Francisco for the funeral, looked at the books, and understood in about 90 seconds that he could not sell the store without admitting that his father had failed. So he kept it. He refinished the counter himself. He fired the part-time employee his father had loved. He put the prices in blue marker because his father had used red, and he needed at least that much distance. He was 34 years old, and he had the particular sharpness of a man who knows exactly what he gave up and needs everyone in the room to know he gave it up for a reason. He was not cruel. He did not enjoy refusing people, but he had learned that the fastest way to close a transaction was to make the seller feel like the object was worth less than they thought. Speed was money. Sentiment was not. His father had run this place on sentiment, and sentiment had left $212,000 in unpaid invoices. The bell above the door rang at 11:14 in the morning. The man who walked in carried a guitar case that was older than most of the inventory on the walls. Black hardshell, cracked along the left hinge, held shut by a bungee cord, looped twice around the body. He set it down on the counter with both hands, the way you set down something that is heavy in a way that has nothing to do with weight. His name was Eugene Marsh, a retired postal carrier who had walked the same route in the Sunset District for 31 years and could still tell you which house on 43rd Avenue got the most catalogs. He wore a coat that was too thin for November because the heavier one was at the dry cleaner, and he did not have the $14 to pick it up. His wife Dorothy had died in September, pancreatic, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. The bills from the hospital had come to $41,000 after insurance, and his pension covered the minimum payments but not the medication he now took for his blood pressure, which cost $240 a month, or the rent, which had gone up by $300 in January and would go up again in February. He had not come here to sell his wife's guitar. He had come here because he had tried the music shop on Clement Street first, and they told him they did not buy used instruments on Tuesdays. He had taken 2 buses to get here. He needed $50, that was all. $50 would cover the prescription refill due on the 16th. He had 2 days. Kyle looked at the case, and then at Eugene, and then back at the case. He did not open it. He put both palms flat on the counter and leaned forward the way people lean forward when they are about to say something they have said many times before. What's in it? A guitar. A classical. My wife played it. Played. Past tense. She passed in September. Kyle nodded once. Not sympathy. Acknowledgement. The nod of a man who had heard this sentence, or one very much like it, 400 times across this counter. Open it. Eugene unhooked the bungee cord, his fingers slow on the rubber, and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on crushed red velvet that had gone pink in patches, was a classical guitar. The body was cedar and rosewood, the fretboard slightly worn at the 3rd and 5th positions, where small hands had pressed the same chords for decades. The tuning pegs were ivory-colored, though not ivory. A small crack ran along the lower bout, thin as a hair, sealed with something that had been applied by someone who cared more than they knew about what they were repairing. Kyle leaned over it the way a mechanic looks under a hood. Quick, professional, not impressed. No label inside, no serial I can see. I don't know about that. She bought it before we were married. 62, maybe 63. 1962. Yes. Kyle straightened up. He picked up the guitar by the neck, turned it, looked at the back, set it down again. He reached for his Dr. Pepper and took a sip before speaking, and the sip was the slight, not the words that followed. The sip, the casualness of it. The way a man drinks in the middle of someone else's grief because he has already decided what this moment is worth. I can do 20. Eugene blinked. I was hoping for 50. I'm sure you were. The 2 women near the window looked up. The man in the Carhartt jacket did not. Eugene put his hand on the edge of the case, not to close it, to steady himself. His fingertips rested on the cracked vinyl, and his thumb moved back and forth over a scratch in the surface, the way a person touches something familiar when nothing else in the room belongs to them. She played it every morning, he said. Before breakfast, she played it for 49 years. Kyle exhaled through his nose. Not a sigh, something flatter than a sigh. The sound of a man who has been given information he did not ask for and does not want to store. Look, I'm not buying the story. I'm buying the guitar, and the guitar is a no-name classical with a crack in the lower bout and no case that isn't held together with a bungee cord. 20 is generous. It's all she had. Then it's worth 20. The room had that particular silence that comes when everyone is pretending not to listen while listening completely. The 2 women had stopped their paperwork. The man in the Carhartt jacket had put down the drill. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hold their hum for a half-second. Kyle turned to the man in the Carhartt jacket, and he said it the way people say things they think are funny, because the alternative is admitting they feel nothing at all. Elderly man walks in, tries to sell his late wife's guitar for $50. That's the kind of Tuesday I'm having. The man in the jacket let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, but close enough that it served the same purpose. Eugene did not move. His hands stayed on the case. His mouth opened and closed, then opened again. She would have wanted someone to play it. Then donate it to Goodwill. I run a business. There was a rack of guitar picks near the register, in a plastic display that rotated when you spun it. It had not been spun in a long time. A thin layer of dust sat in the grooves of the plastic, and someone had hung a yellow post-it note on the side that read, "Not free," in the same blue marker as everything else. Carlos had not moved from the bench. He had been watching the way a man watches something he recognizes but cannot yet name. The old man, the case, the bungee cord, the way his fingers stayed on the vinyl like he was reading it in Braille. Carlos had buried his wife. He knew what it looked like when a man held something that still smelled like the person who was gone. He stood up. The bench creaked. Nobody turned. He walked to the counter, and his steps were quiet on the worn carpet, the kind of quiet that comes from a lifetime of entering rooms where the music had not started yet. He stood beside Eugene, not between them, and looked at the guitar lying open in its case. Then he looked at Kyle. "The top is solid cedar," he said. His voice was low and even, not angry, not performative. The voice of someone describing a fact the way a doctor describes a scan. "The bracing pattern is fan strut, which means it was built by hand, not in a factory. The rosewood on the back has grain figuring you do not see anymore, because the trees they came from were protected by sites in 1992, and the crack you are looking at was sealed with hide glue, not Titebond, which means whoever repaired it understood what they were holding." He paused. He looked at the guitar one more time. "You should look inside the sound hole before you price it." Kyle stared at him. 34 years old, 3 years behind the counter, 6 years as a session guitarist, in a city that had already forgotten him. He knew the words this man had just used. He knew they were correct. That made it worse. Kyle recovered the way people recover when they have been corrected in public, which is to say badly and with volume. "And you are?" Carlos said nothing. "You work here? You a luthier? You an appraiser? Because I've been running this shop for 3 years, and I've got a guy who comes in on Thursdays, who actually gets paid to tell me what things are worth." Carlos looked at him calmly. He did not smile. He put his hands in the pockets of his windbreaker, and his right hand found the chamois cloth and the rosewood pick inside it, and he held it without thinking, the way you hold a stone from a beach you visited with someone who is gone. "I am a customer," Carlos said. "Then sit down and wait your turn." A small sound came from one of the women near the window, not quite a laugh. A breath pushed through closed lips. Kyle glanced at her, then back at Carlos, and he made a decision that would define the next 6 months of his life, without knowing it. "Old guys always come in here thinking they know more than me because they've been alive longer. That's not how it works. Age doesn't make you an expert. It just makes you slow." Carlos nodded once. He did not take his hands out of his pockets. He looked at Eugene, who was standing very still, holding the edge of his guitar case with both hands, and he looked at the guitar lying on the red velvet, like a patient on a table. He had no idea he had just insulted the only man alive who could have told him what that guitar was really worth. It is a strange thing, being dismissed because of your age, because of the lines on your hands, or the gray in your hair, or the way you pause before answering, not because you do not know, but because you are choosing your words carefully. Almost everyone listening has felt it at least once, that quiet heat behind the sternum, that decision about whether to answer or to let it pass. Carlos Santana was about to answer it, in the only language he had left. Carlos walked back to the bench. He sat down. He put his hands on his knees, and he looked at them. The knuckles were thicker now than they had been when he was 20, the joints wider, the veins standing up under the skin like roots growing too close to the surface. There was a small scar on his left index finger from a broken string at a concert in Buenos Aires in 1983, and the pad of his right thumb had a callus that had softened over 2 years, but never fully disappeared, like a footprint in concrete that rain had been wearing down season after season. He had not played in 26 months. The last notes he played were in a hospital room for a woman who could not hear them. He did not know if she had heard them. He would never know, and the not knowing had been enough to stop him. Because the possibility that she had not heard meant the possibility that the last time he played had meant nothing, and if the last time meant nothing, then maybe none of the times before it had either. That is what grief does to a musician. It does not take the skill. It takes the reason. But the old man at the counter was holding a guitar case with both hands, and the case was held shut with a bungee cord, and inside it was a guitar that a woman had played every morning for 49 years before breakfast, and the man behind the counter had turned it into a number. $20. The number sat in the room like a verdict, and something in Carlos's chest moved for the first time in months, something that felt less like anger and more like recognition. Carlos reached into his left pocket. He took out the chamois cloth. He unwrapped it slowly. The rosewood pick sat in his palm, dark and smooth, the edges rounded by decades of use, the grain still visible under the oils from his skin. His mother had carved it with a kitchen knife on a linoleum floor. She had died in 1991. He had played with this pick in front of 200,000 people. He had played with it for Anna in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and plastic. His hands were shaking. He closed his fist around the pick. Then he opened it. Then he stood up. He walked to the left wall, where the guitars hung in their crooked constellation. He looked at them the way a surgeon looks at instruments laid out on a tray, assessing not by beauty but by function. Most of them were decorative, display pieces, guitars that had been played badly and then hung up the way retired jerseys are hung up, with more ceremony than they deserved. In the middle of the second row he found a dreadnought acoustic, a Martin, not vintage, early 2000s maybe, spruce top, mahogany back and sides. The strings were old. He could see the oxidation from 4 feet away, the way new strings shine and old strings absorb light like tired eyes. But the neck was straight. The action looked low enough. The bridge had not lifted. He reached up and took it off the wall. The price tag read, $425. You want to try it? You ask first. Kyle had come around the edge of the counter. His arms were crossed. Eugene was still standing at the counter, his case still open, his hand still resting on the vinyl. May I try it? Carlos said. Are you buying? I would like to hear it first. This isn't a library. Carlos looked at him, patient, unbothered. The look of a man who has been told no by people who were considerably better at it than this. 1 minute. Kyle exhaled. He looked at the 2 women. He looked at the man in the Carhartt jacket. He was performing now. The performance of a man who is in charge and needs witnesses. Fine. 1 minute. You break a string, you're paying for a restring. $20. Carlos carried the Martin to the wooden bench and sat down with it across his lap. He tuned it by ear. The low E was nearly a half-step flat. He brought each string up slowly, listening to the intervals, adjusting the pegs with his thumb and index finger, the way a watchmaker adjusts a spring, by feel, not by force. The room was noisy. Someone's phone was playing a video with the volume up. A woman was asking about a layaway policy for a ring. Nobody was watching him. Nobody had any reason to. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Outside, a bus passed on Valencia Street, its brakes hissing at the stop 3 doors down. The 2 women near the window had returned to their paperwork. One was writing a check, her pen moving in slow, careful loops. The other was reading the fine print on a pawn receipt, her lips moving slightly as she followed the sentences. The man in the Carhartt jacket was back to examining the drill, turning it over in his hands, squeezing the trigger without a battery in it. Click, click, click. Kyle had gone back behind the counter. He was typing something on the computer with 2 fingers. The security camera feeds showed 4 angles of a room where nothing was happening. Eugene stood at the counter, his guitar case still open, Dorothy's guitar still lying on the velvet. He had not moved. He did not seem to know what to do next, and that uncertainty had settled into his shoulders like weather that would not break. The Martin was in tune now. Carlos held it properly, left hand on the neck, thumb behind the 2nd fret, 4 fingers curved and waiting. His right hand rested on the strings near the sound hole, the rosewood pick between his thumb and index finger. He had not held a pick in 26 months. The grain pressed against his callus like a handshake from someone he had been avoiding. He closed his eyes, and he played the first note. The note filled the room the way water fills a glass, from the bottom up, pushing everything else to the edges. It was a single open G, held for 4 full seconds, and it had a quality that does not come from the guitar, or the strings, or the wood. It comes from the hands, from 37,000 hours of practice across 51 years, from the specific pressure of a thumb that knows exactly how much force to apply the way a tongue knows how much salt is enough. Then he played the 2nd note, and the room began to change. It started with the woman writing the check. Her pen stopped, not a dramatic stop, not a gasp. The pen just stopped, and her hand stayed where it was, hovering above the paper, and she looked up the way a deer looks up when a branch snaps in the woods. Then the other woman looked up, because the first woman had stopped writing, and that absence of motion was louder than any sound. The man with the drill put it down without looking where he set it. It landed on the edge of a shelf and teetered there. Carlos was playing Cathedral of Rain, the song he had written for Anna, the song he had played in that hospital room. The melody moved through the room like weather, curling around the glass cases and the amplifiers and the crooked guitars on the wall. It was not loud. It was not fast. It was the sound of a man who has nothing left to prove, playing for the only reason that has ever mattered, which is that the song exists and someone somewhere needs to hear it. The woman near the window reached for her phone, slowly, the way you reach for something when you are not sure whether reaching will break the spell. She held it up. Then the man in the Carhartt jacket held his up. Then the other woman. 3 phones, 3 angles, 3 small bright screens showing the same man on the same bench playing a guitar that cost $425, like it was worth $400,000. Kyle heard it from behind the counter. His hands stopped on the keyboard. His fingers hovered above the keys the way fingers hover when the brain has sent a new instruction and the body has not yet decided whether to follow it. The sound coming from that bench was not a customer trying out a guitar. It was something else entirely. He knew it the way a session guitarist knows it, the way a man who was never quite good enough knows it, when he hears someone who always was. Kyle came around the counter. His arms, which had been crossed for most of the morning, fell to his sides. The posture of authority left his body the way air leaves a tire, not all at once, but with a slow, irreversible hiss that changed the shape of everything. He stood at the edge of the counter and watched. Carlos's fingers moved across the fretboard with the economy of a man who has long since stopped trying to impress anyone, including himself. No flourishes, no speed for the sake of speed. Every note landed where it belonged, and the spaces between the notes were as deliberate as the notes themselves. The silences were the architecture. The notes were the light coming through. The song built, not louder, deeper. The harmonics rang in a way that made the glass cases vibrate, a tiny rattle from a watch face inside the nearest display. And the rattle became part of the music because everything in the room had become part of the music. The hum of the lights, the distant bus, the faint drip from a pipe somewhere in the back. Kyle's face changed. The color left it in sections, like a tide pulling back from a beach, starting at the jawline and moving upward. His mouth opened, not to speak, the way a mouth opens when the lungs demand more air than the nose can supply. He stepped backward, and his hip caught the edge of a display table, and two guitar stands rattled against each other. The song ended the way a prayer ends, not with a final chord, but with a breath. Carlos held the last note until it was gone, until the only sound in the room was the fluorescent hum and the distant traffic on Valencia, and the ticking of a clock nobody had noticed was there. Then he opened his eyes. Eugene was crying, not sobbing, not making a sound. His eyes were wet, and his mouth was a thin, straight line, and his hand was pressed flat against his chest, over his coat, over his heart, as if he needed to hold something in. He had heard this song before. Dorothy had played it, every morning, for 49 years, not note for note, not with the same precision, but close enough that the shape of it, the skeleton of the melody, was the same song that had woken him up on 10,000 mornings in their apartment in the sunset. He had eaten breakfast to this song. He had read the newspaper to this song. He had kissed her goodbye at the front door while the last notes were still hanging in the kitchen air. Carlos stood up. He set the Martin on the bench carefully and walked to the counter. He looked at Dorothy's guitar lying in its case on the red velvet. He reached inside the sound hole gently with 2 fingers and turned the guitar toward the light from the window. There, on the inside back brace, written in black ink that had faded to brown over 46 years, was a signature. C. Santana, 1971. And below it, in smaller letters, written at an angle because there was not much room on the brace. For the woman in the 3rd row who knew the words before I did. He stared at it for a long time. Then he looked at Eugene. "I signed this guitar," he said quietly. 46 years ago, at a club on Haight Street. I had been playing for maybe 2 years, 60 people in the room, and a woman in the 3rd row was singing along to a song I had only performed once before. She knew every word. I asked her after the show how she knew, and she said she had heard me playing it on the sidewalk outside the Fillmore a month earlier, and had memorized it while she walked to work. Eugene's hand moved to his mouth. He pressed his fingers against his lips. His eyes were wide and wet, and he was shaking his head very slowly, not in denial, but in the way a man shakes his head when the world suddenly reveals a connection that was always there, invisible, running underneath everything like a wire under a floorboard. "That was Dorothy," he said. "I know," Carlos said. "I remember her." Eugene's knees softened. Not a collapse, a yielding, the way a man yields when something too large enters his body and there is no room for it alongside the air. Carlos reached out and held his arm, and the two of them stood there for 3 seconds that lasted much longer than 3 seconds, a hand on a forearm, a stranger holding a stranger who was not a stranger and had never been. The woman near the window said, "Oh my God," but not loudly. She said it the way people say it when they actually mean it, when it is not an expression but a prayer. The man in the Carhartt jacket put his phone down and picked it up again. His hands were unsteady. Someone opened the front door and the bell rang, and a cold draft came in from Valencia Street and moved through the room like a guest arriving late and not knowing where to sit. The woman who had been reading the pawn receipt stood up, and her chair scraped against the floor, and the scraping sound was the loudest thing in the room for a full second. Kyle was behind the counter again. He had moved there without anyone noticing. His hands were flat on the glass top, and his head was down, and he was looking at the torn halves of a receipt he had written 20 minutes ago. $20 for a guitar that Carlos Santana had signed in 1971. $20 for a guitar a woman had played every morning for 49 years. $20. Anyone who has ever stood on either side of a counter like that, the buying side or the selling side, already knows what was happening inside Kyle Beckman's chest. The specific heat of realizing that you have been small in a room where someone else chose to be generous, that you measured something precious with the wrong instrument entirely, and that the error was not in your arithmetic, but in your understanding of what was being measured, that the person you dismissed had every reason to dismiss you in return and simply chose not to. Nearly everyone has stood in that room at least once, on one side or the other, holding something valuable, while someone told them it was not worth the trouble. The difference, always, is what happens after the music stops. Carlos set the Martin back on its stand on the wall. He walked to the counter where Kyle was standing, and he stood across from him, the glass case between them, the pocket watches and wedding rings beneath them, like evidence in a trial that had already reached its verdict. "You want to know why I came in here today?" Carlos said. Kyle did not answer. His jaw was tight. His hands had not moved from the glass. "I came in here because I used to live on this street. Before any of it. Before the records, before the tours, before any of it meant anything to anyone other than me. I used to walk past this shop when your father ran it, Manny. He let me play the guitars on the wall when I was 20 years old and could not afford a new set of strings. He never charged me. He never asked for anything back. He just let me sit in here and play." Kyle's jaw tightened, not in anger, in the effort of holding something back that had been building behind his teeth for 3 years. "I know what it costs to keep a shop like this open," Carlos said. "I know it is not what you wanted. I know you gave something up to be here, and I know it does not feel like anyone noticed. That is not nothing. Your father would have understood that. But that man," he looked at Eugene, "brought you the only thing he has left of someone he loved. You do not have to buy it, but you cannot make it small. You cannot turn it into a number and a receipt, because it is not a number. It is a person, and the person is gone." Carlos reached into his left pocket and took out the chamois cloth. He unwrapped it on the counter between them. The rosewood pick lay on the soft fabric, dark as coffee, smooth as a river stone, the grain still visible under 51 years of oil and sweat and music and grief. "My mother carved this for me when I was 9 years old," he said, "in San Juan, with a kitchen knife and sandpaper on a linoleum floor. I played with this pick at my first concert, my 10th, my 100th. It was in my hand when I recorded my first album, and it was in my hand when I played for my wife the night she died. It is the only thing I have of my mother's." He picked it up and held it out to Eugene. "Your wife played my song for 49 years. She heard it once, in a crowd, in 1971, and she took it home and made it hers. That is the highest compliment a songwriter will ever receive. It means the song did what it was supposed to do. It means it lived in your house. It woke you up in the morning. It became ordinary, and ordinary is the only thing that lasts." Eugene took the pick with both hands. He held it the way you hold something that is too light for how much it means, too small for how far it has traveled. The rosewood was warm from Carlos's pocket, warm from 51 years of grip and release, and the warmth passed between them through the wood, through the grain his mother had carved on a kitchen floor in another country, in another decade, in another life. "Don't sell the guitar," Carlos said. "Not for 50. Not for 50,000. Keep it. Play it if you can, and if you can't, keep it where you can see it." They walked outside together. The rain had stopped, but the sidewalk was still wet, and the reflected neon from the shop sign made the puddles glow pink and white in alternating pulses as the M continued to flicker. Valencia Street sounded the way it always did at noon, buses and bikes and a man arguing in Spanish about a parking meter. Eugene zipped his thin coat and pulled the collar up against the November air. The guitar case was under his arm, the bungee cord fastened tight. "You play anywhere I could come hear you?" he asked. Carlos looked at him. For the first time in 26 months, the question did not feel like a weight pressed against his chest. It felt like a door, a small one, ordinary-sized. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe. Dorothy would have liked that. She had good taste." Eugene smiled. Small. The kind of smile that arrives late and stays only a moment, like a bird landing on a wire and leaving before you can point it out to someone else. In March of 2018, 4 months later, Carlos Santana played his first public concert in nearly 3 years. A small venue in North Beach, 82 seats, no promotional campaign, just a listing in the calendar section of the Chronicle that most people missed. He played Cathedral of Rain as the closer, and the room was standing before the last chord finished ringing. The video from the pawn shop had been viewed 14 million times by then, and the comments section had become its own kind of memorial, thousands of strangers writing about guitars they wished they had kept, and people they wished they had listened to. Eugene Marsh was in the 3rd row. He was wearing a heavier coat. He had paid off the prescription. Kyle Beckman closed Manny's golden guitar in June of that year. He told people the lease had gone up, and that was true. But on the last day, after the inventory had been packed and the sign taken down, he spent 40 minutes alone in the empty shop, taking down the last few hooks from the wall. When he reached the spot where the Martin Dreadnought had hung, he stood there for a long time, looking at the clean rectangle it had left on the wall, where the paint was a shade lighter than everywhere else, a ghost of the thing that had been there. He opened a guitar repair shop in Oakland the following September, small place. He fixed instruments for people who could not afford new ones. He did not put prices in blue marker, he used red. He once told a friend, late at night, over a beer he had been holding for too long, that age does not make you an expert, but sometimes, he said, it makes you the only person in the room who remembers what something is worth.